to the bread kitchen. In this edition of Bread Making Basics, I'm going to talk about proving, glazing and baking. Proving is the name for the final rising of the dough just before you bake the bread, and it's important to get this right. If you don't allow your dough to rise enough, then your final loaf or rolls will be heavy and dense. If you overprove though, if you allow the dough to rise too much, you can get a different kind of problem. So here's a loaf that's been very overproved. A couple of things to notice. There's a big hole down here. I can put my finger in where the crust has actually burst. And this, well, it feels a bit like a balloon. So let's cut into it and see what we've got inside. So you can see there's like a big cavern at the top here. I can put my finger in quite a way. And the other telltale sign of overproving is this hole here, which is quite large. And I would expect to find holes like that all throughout the bread. When you overprove bread, the little bubbles inside the dough start to coalesce and make bigger bubbles, which is why you end up with big holes in the bread. Now, a general rule of thumb is that you want the dough to roughly double in size during the final proving, ready for baking. Brushing on a glaze is usually the last thing you would do before you finally bake the loaf. And there are a number of glazes out there, all of which affect the appearance of the final bread. So let's have a look at a few. So I've got 8 buns here which have been proved. I'm going to start by leaving this one plain. I'm going to brush this one with a mixture of half a teaspoon of salt in 2 tablespoons of water. This one I'm going to glaze with milk. Brush some milk onto the top. This one I'll glaze with egg white, an egg white which has been mixed with 2 tablespoons of water. This middle one I'll brush with an egg yolk which has been mixed with 2 tablespoons of water. And this one at the end is just a beaten egg. Egg-based glazes are good if you're going to sprinkle something on the top like seeds, because it gives it something to stick to. Now this one I'll brush with olive oil, and this one I'll brush with melted butter. Now we just need to pop this tray in the oven and see what we get. So now we can see the effects of the glazes. This is the control with no glaze, this is the salt water, and this is the milk. Both of these are slightly browner than our control. These are the egg glazed loaves, and we go from a kind of satiny sheen through to a glossy finish as we go from egg white, egg yolk to full egg. And here with the oil and butter, I don't know if the camera can pick up the subtlety here, but these have a more slightly golden colour than our control without the glaze. I'll tell you one thing that the glaze hasn't affected, and that's the softness of these buns. All squidgy. Yum. So glazes only affect the appearance of the final bread, and the longer you bake, the more pronounced those effects will be. I've just baked a few small rolls here for 12 minutes, but if I was baking a series of larger loaves for say 35 minutes, the effects that you'd see would be much more pronounced. Now when I bake bread in my oven, there's a couple of things to notice. One is I've got a thermometer which tells me what the oven temperature is. That way I know that the oven's at the right temperature when I put things in. But secondly, I tend to arrange the trays so that the middle of the loaf or the middle of the buns, if I'm baking buns, is pretty much in the middle of the oven. And that's the case here. Whenever I use a loaf tin for baking, I usually allow the loaf to rise so that it almost fills the tin. You can see it's popping over the top, but there's a little bit of room in the corners there so that if the loaf does rise a little, it's still got plenty of support. This has just come out of the oven. Now, you can tell if a loaf like this is cooked simply by sticking a thermometer into it. This is a meat thermometer. I'll dab it into the middle of the loaf. Well, let's see what temperature comes up. It should reach 90 degrees. There we are, 90 degrees or just over, which means that my loaf is cooked. The other thing is that it should sound hollow when tapped. Bread making is one of these things that the more you do, the better you get, and part of that is confidence. For example, I no longer jab a thermometer in my loaves because I know that if I bake a certain shaped bread at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, it's going to be cooked, and that comes from experience. I hope you found this video useful, and do join me next time in the bread kitchen.